1.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us for today's program. As you know, the Chamber works together with a bipartisan group of elected officials and policymakers to ensure our entire region continues to plan for growth, improve infrastructure, and reform property taxes and school finance. This session, our particular focus was on economic development, education policy, workforce development, and infrastructure. We began the session with a full set of priorities, and over the past several months, our team has walked miles in and around the Capitol to make sure that the voice of the Austin business community is heard. It was a unique and busy session, especially I know that all of you who worked over there know that for sure. Our team tracked 694 bills, 200 bills were supported by the Chamber, and out of those 200, 84 of those bills focused on DEI-related policies. 6 bills were opposed by the Chamber, and none of those were sent to the governor. You can learn more about our legislative session and the Chamber's work advocating on behalf of business by following the link that is now being posted in the chat. Today, we are honored to be joined by the hardest working people over there, members of our Central Texas House delegation leading the way at the state capitol, and our moderator, who we all know and trust to keep us up to date during the session on what is going on inside the Capitol. But before we get started, I'd like to thank those who make this series possible. So thank you to our pivotal partners, Amazon, Ascension Seton, Dell Technologies, PIMCO, and Wells Fargo. And to our foundation partners, and to our many corporate partners. I'd also like to thank the sponsors that made this series possible. First, I'd like to thank our corporate sustainers and our capital sustainers and our supporting sustainers. And now I'm so excited to introduce our moderator, Ashley Godot. Ashley is the midday and political anchor at KVUE News in Austin. A Houston native, Ashley developed a love for writing early in life and decided to use that passion to launch a career in journalism. Ashley's work in Austin has earned her recognitions from the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, Associated Press, and several Austin area organizations. Ashley, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm going to let you take it away.
Thank you guys for having me. It's such a pleasure to be a part of this program. So let's introduce you to our panel, the lawmakers who are joining us today. We have Representative Donna Howard. For the past 14 years, Representative Howard has been advancing policies that improve the lives of Texans and her constituents. Now, one of the more senior members of the House, Donna is a leader on school finance, nursing, women's health, and accountable government. In 2019, she was named Texas Monthly's best legislature. She made it onto the list. She currently serves on the Appropriations Committee as well as the State Affairs Committee. Donna is the chairwoman of the Texas Women's Health Caucus and recently served on the Austin Chamber of Commerce's Opening Central Texas for Business Task Force. As a member of the House Democratic Caucus, she is in 2 work groups, education and public health. We're also joined today by Representative James Talarico. Representative Talarico is a former educator and nonprofit leader and public school teacher. He was elected to serve House District 52, which encompasses parts of North Austin and Round Rock. Representative Talarico earned his bachelor's degree in government from UT Austin and his master's in education policy from Harvard University. He currently serves as the youngest member of the Texas legislature. He sits on the Calendars Committee, the Public Education Committee, and Juvenile Justice and Family Issues Committee. In his first term, Representative Talarico helped write historic school finance reform legislation that infused Texas schools with $11.6 billion in new education funding. And finally, with us this afternoon, we have Representative Erin Zwiener. Representative Zwiener is an author, educator, and conservativist who is currently serving her second term in the House. She's committed to fighting for our Texas values of healthy communities, inclusivity, and common sense government. Representative Zwiener serves on the House Committee on Appropriations. She is the Article 3 Vice Chair. She serves on Public Health as well as House Administration. She is also a member of the House Democratic Caucus, LGBTQ Caucus, IT Caucus, Criminal Justice Reform Caucus, and Women's Health Caucus. She's in all the caucuses. In January of 2021, Representative Zwiener established the Caucus on Climate, Environment, and Energy Industry and serves as the chair. Thank you so much for joining us today. All right, so we want to start first by going around this virtual room, if you will, and asking each of you, what was the highlight and the low light of the session for you personally? Representative Howard, we'll begin with you.
It's kind of a hard answer to give because it was such a strange session, coming into it with the pandemic and everybody's mind. And we'd been living with that for a while and knew that we needed to be addressing the pandemic. And then, here, not only a month when we had the freeze and Uri hit and the crisis of our power grid. And so all of a sudden, another major crisis that we needed to be confronting. Both of those issues were things that we dealt with to some extent. I don't know that I'd call it a highlight because we really didn't do what we needed to do for either and got distracted with other issues. So I would say one of the highlights that I will point to, and I know my colleagues had a lot to do with this as well, and that is that we maintained the funding for House Bill 3, which is our public education funding. We had put significantly more dollars into education last session, and despite the fact that we had some challenges with our budget, we were able to maintain that funding, and I think that was probably the highlight of the session. Now, did you just ask me highlights at this point? Or
I want your low light as well.
I kind of alluded to that already. The fact that instead of staying focused on COVID and the power grid, which I would assume just about every Texan wanted us to take care of while we were here in the short time that the legislature's in session. We did that for a while, but got distracted probably halfway through the session, maybe even before, with all kinds of issues that got us off track. The issues like permitless carry and more abortion restrictions, the election legislation, which obviously we could talk about too, and how that came about at the end. And James, I know, could talk about the critical race theory and all of these things that really took us off track, spent hours and days on issues that were not something that were going to make a big difference in the lives of Texans right now in terms of getting power and energy and in terms of addressing a pandemic. So really, a lot of the session was pretty low.
Representative Talarico, your high and your low.
Yeah, I completely agree with Representative Howard's assessment. This session was a disappointment, I think is the most charitable way to describe it. We failed as a state government to meet this historic moment, and Representative Howard kind of ran through the initial challenges we faced with recovering from COVID and rebuilding our economy after the recession, and then of course the winter storm. I'd also add that we had an insurrection in our national capital in January of this year. It was, I think, just a week or so before, 2 weeks before the legislative session started here in Texas. We came into the Capitol on a day that's usually celebratory, and we were surrounded by armed guards with giant rifles. And instead of addressing that political crisis or a crisis in democracy, our state legislature decided to double down on Donald Trump's big lie and push voter suppression. So not only were we ignoring crises like the pandemic, like the recession, like the blackout, we were actively contributing to the political crisis that we face in our country. And so, and as Representative Howard already said, instead of solving problems most of our colleagues chose to wage culture wars that were destructive and dangerous and divisive. And I was proud of our Central Texas delegation for standing up against some of these efforts to grandstand and to score political points, and instead try to keep our eye on the ball and solve the problems that we are sent to the Capitol to solve. So, I guess my low light would be our failure overall to meet the moment. My highlight, I think, was really seeing thoughtful legislators like the ones that we have in our region, but also, thoughtful Democrats and Republicans that I think, really aren't interested in these culture wars. Watching those legislators be able to make the most out of a bad session. We're probably going to talk about, what we were able to do to address maternal mortality in Texas. We expanded health insurance for the youngest Texans. We made progress on early childhood. The fiscal landscape was much better than we thought it could be. I don't think the budget looks the way it should. If the three of us were writing the budget, it would look a lot different. But I think given what we could have been facing in terms of deep cuts to critical services, the budget looks pretty good in that light. So I guess the silver lining was my highlight for this session.
And Representative Zwiener, what about you?
Well, Representative Howard and Representative Talarico have done such a good job talking about the big picture that I'm going to go ahead and get a little bit more specific. A personal highlight for me was getting to lay out House Bill 48 as the last bill on our House Bill deadline night. So we run up against these midnight deadlines, and at this point, we just started rushing through bills. Nobody thought I was going to make it. And this is a piece of legislation that provided sexual harassment protections to over 300,000 Texans. And those are folks who work for businesses with 15 or fewer employees that weren't covered by the federal Civil Rights Act. So this legislation expanded it, makes sure that every single Texas worker has access to due process, which is good both for workers and for businesses, because if folks have due process to participate in, they are less likely to go to the court of public opinion, which is a hard place to get good answers for anybody. So that legislation was laid out at 11:59 p.m. on budget night, or I'm sorry, on deadline night, House Bill deadline night, and we were able to lay the Senate bill out on top of it and pass that and send it to the governor. So now we're just waiting for the governor on that piece of legislation. That was an extra big highlight for me because that bill died on deadline night 2 years ago. So it was very gratifying to get it over the finish line this time. Another personal highlight, Representative Talarico alluded to this, and I know Representative Donna Howard has been advocating for this, but passing Representative Tony Rose's House Bill 133, which provides another 4 months for a total of 6 months of coverage for moms postpartum if they're covered by Medicaid. We were hoping to get 12 months. We still have some more work to do, but 6 months will save lives. And so that's a huge highlight for me. Lowlight, as my colleagues have alluded to, there were a lot of lowlights. But for me, my personal low moment was seeing how determined our public health chair was to push House Bill 1399 through as fast as possible. And that was legislation that would have banned gender affirming healthcare for Texas minors. So that was pushed through incredibly quickly, despite the pleas of several members of the Public Health Committee. In fact, we voted that bill out of committee while the public comment portal was still live less than 24 hours after we'd heard the bill in committee. That said, that story has a happy ending. We did beat that bill, and I really want to thank the business community for the role y'all played in helping us stop that piece of legislation in a session where so many bad bills were forced through. It was a relief that we were able to hold that one off, and we couldn't have done it without y'all.
Hey, Ashley, I'm sorry, but Aaron's now made me remember I need to say something about my own personal highlight here too. And last session, we were able to create the Sexual Assault Survivors Task Force out of the governor's office, which brought together all the different entities that have anything to do with dealing with sexual assaults. It's been an incredible effort. I'm so proud of the people that have been a part of it. And they came out with 11 recommendations. We were able to get the legislation passed this time in some form or fashion to address all 11 of those recommendations. So I'm real proud of the legislature and the Sexual Assault Survivors Task Force for putting this together. It's going to make a huge difference in the justice system for the survivors, and to ensure that they get what they need, the supports that they need. Law enforcement has what they need, and those that are delivering the health care, the whole gamut. So really proud of that, and I wanted to mention that. Thank you.
You know, perhaps the most important bill that is passed, not only this session, but every session, is the state budget. But because of the pandemic, this budget process was a little bit different. Initially, the comptroller predicted there would be a deficit, and of course, the list of needs were quite long. The legislature, thankfully, able to pass a budget, didn't have to dip into the rainy day fund in order to do that. Representative Howard, as a member of the Appropriations Committee, talk to us a little bit about the budget process this session. You know, the things that you were able to add in that you were excited about, but also the things you guys had to cut out.
Yeah, well, it was a very different budget session. I know that Representative Zwiener was on it with me as well. This is my 5th time to be on appropriations, and it was different for a lot of reasons. But there was definitely less involvement on the part of the committee members than what we normally have, which was very disappointing. That being said, it was a budget that at least maintained. It's actually overall, the budget is about 5% less than the previous 2-year budget, which is pretty amazing with a growing state and with needs from the pandemic and everything else, that we actually have a lower budget, but that's what we ended up happening. We got. We also ended up pretty much having the same amount in the Economic Stabilization Fund, the rainy day fund, that we started with. Which is also pretty incredible. Around $11.6 billion remaining in that fund. I think some of us believed that we could have used that for some more things and that could have helped Texas, but we did at least put some money into IT upgrades and into capital improvements. Glad to see that we're going to complete the work with the Austin State Hospital, which is a real positive thing for our community. But again, it's, there's still a lot in there. I will say, personally, I was able to get some money in for working with the children of abuse and programs that are helping with sexual assaults, those kinds of things. So I was glad to have that put in there. We did put some more money into healthcare that I think was helpful. But as Representative Zwiener said, we could have expanded postpartum coverage to a full 12 months, which has been recommended by the statewide task force that's been looking at this for years, that would have been an important thing to do to save these moms' lives. And unfortunately, we didn't get there. But, it's a decent budget. Federal funds are a big part of it, and we can talk about that some more if you'd like. But we still have some challenges ahead, and we still need to figure out how we're going to spend some more of these federal dollars, which hopefully will be coming back in one of our special sessions to deal with.
That is, in fact, my next question for Representative Zwiener. You are also on the Appropriations Committee, and we want to, like Representative Howard mentioned, there's a very large sum of money that the legislature did not spend from the American Rescue Plan funding. That's that federal government funding. Governor Greg Abbott has said that when he calls you guys back for that special session on redistricting, this is how a lot has happened since he initially said this, but he said when he call you guys back in the fall for redistricting, lawmakers will also be able to weigh in on some of that spending. How do you want to see that money spent?
Yeah, so there's about $16.7 billion of just about unrestricted dollars that we can decide how we spend as a state. In addition, there's ongoing conversations at the federal level about an infrastructure plan. We'll see if those come to fruition or not. But the initial approximate amount we would have been eligible for under that would have been about another $167 billion. So we could be talking about quite a bit of money that we're spending in this special session. I think we should be spending it on making sure our infrastructure is resilient. If we learned one thing from this winter storm, it is that we were caught unprepared. You know, I'm the daughter of a Boy Scout, related to several others. I don't like to be caught unprepared, and I don't think Texans much enjoyed it either. And one of the most fiscally responsible things we can do is put it into these one-time infrastructure upgrades that don't create an ongoing expense for the state that we then have to cover through our regular revenue. So I'd like to see us upgrade our water systems. I'd like to see us upgrade our grid, doing things like advanced meter technologies so that if we have a power outage, folks like Austin Power and Pedernales Electric Co-op can effectively roll different homes and protect houses with people who depend on medical equipment to live. I want us to get generators for dialysis centers so that we don't lose people because they're unable to access life-saving kidney care. I want us to keep our nursing homes warm in the case of extreme weather events. These are all things that we can invest these dollars in and make a real difference. Now, would we spend all $6.7 billion on that? No, but we've got infrastructure projects all around this state that we can invest in. The other place I'd like to see us invest those dollars is in workforce development and financial aid for students. You know, we know we are coming off an economic downturn. It has been an unusual economic downturn because it's been in the middle of a pandemic. So we haven't quite yet seen folks rush back to school like they normally do during a downturn, but that's probably what we're about to see. And we know that our economic landscape has changed due to the pandemic and that not every job that went away is going to come back. And so a lot of people need new training to be prepared for the next stage of their career. And that's something that I think we as a state should be using these federal dollars to invest in so that we can recover as quickly and as efficiently from this pandemic as possible.
You know, sticking on the budget, last session, the legislature passed that historic school finance reform bill, House Bill 3. Those changes remain fully funded this session. A lot of people, of course, glad to see that. Representative Talarico, I want you to talk to us about the significance of that and whether or not that's truly enough to help educate our public school students.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's also, you know, I'm sure I speak for Representative Howard and Zwiener when I say it's a little sad to think about House Bill 3 and the 2019 session, the last session, because it was so different from the one we just went through. So this session was like a bad sequel, I think, to 2019. But you know, I think one of the highlights was passing our Hb3 Cleanup Bill, which was a team effort with the Public Education Committee, taking a look at what worked in Hb3 that was passed in 2019 and what needed to be tweaked, or what needed to be how did the funding need to change, and you know, I'm pretty proud of the result. Again, you know, it's not, I think, what our education finance system would look like if we were designing it from scratch. But given the reforms that were put in place in Hb3 and the improvements toward quality and toward equity, I think it's a big leap forward for our system. You know, one thing I do want to mention is I'm sure everyone watching knows that our schools and our administrators and our staff and our teachers had to step up during the pandemic like they've never had to step up before, and they had to adapt to this crisis that we found ourselves in, and help our students through the trauma of the pandemic, of the police violence last summer, and the you know, the turmoil in our world. And so we know that our students, along with our teachers, are not just suffering academically; they're also suffering emotionally. And we have a mental health crisis that has been exacerbated by the last year. And so I'm proud that in our cleanup bill, we were able to open up some parts of the school finance formula, in particular the comp ed allotment, which goes to help at-risk students, low-income students. We were able to open that up to be able to fund social emotional learning programs on all of our campuses, which were needed before the pandemic, but they're needed now more than ever, because our students have to be able to manage their emotions, be able to learn how to have healthy relationships with themselves and with other people, before they can be successful in reading, writing, and arithmetic. So very happy that our legislature on a bipartisan basis is recognizing that our public education system needs to be more humane and needs to be serving the whole child and treating students as human beings first and students second. So that I think was a major part of the bill this session, and it's one that I think will make a difference in the lives of kids, families, and educators.
And Ashley, I'm going to interrupt again. I'm sorry, I do this all the time because I always learn things.
It's why we love you, Representative Howard.
But one other positive thing that I know that the chamber really cares about is the workforce pipeline, and that includes higher education, which we were really concerned for a while that we were not going to have the funding we needed in higher education. And then, of course, one of the particular things of that is the tuition assistance programs, which is a huge help to students in this state. And before we went into session, the leadership had asked for 5% cuts throughout a lot of agencies, including higher education, and financial aid was one of those that got cut. Well, thankfully, we were able to not only restore that 5% cut, but get an additional $110 million into the Texas grants and TEOG and TEG programs to make sure that our Texas students are getting the assistance they need to continue their post-secondary education to be prepared for the workforce needs of our community and the entire state. So that was one of the positive things I wanted to mention as well.
You know, Representative Talarico, sticking with education because it is such a big priority, were there some other legislation that you think is going to significantly impact Texas children, either for better or for worse?
You know, this session we've already talked about. There were a lot of bad ideas put forward in all kinds of policy areas. Unfortunately, public education was not spared those bad ideas, and there were a lot of controversial bills which would have made it easier for the state of Texas or the education agency to be able to take over public school districts that are not meeting certain performance standards in our accountability system. And that was, I think, a lot of observers in the education community thought that those bills were not well drafted and not well thought through. Many of them ended up dying on the floor of the Texas House. But as part of this Hb3 cleanup, we were able to help usher through some other reforms and tweaks to our education accountability system. And one in particular, my colleague on the Public Education Committee, Representative Diego Bernal, who represents San Antonio, was able to tweak something called 1882, which allows a district or a school that's not meeting their accountability requirements to be able to partner with a nonprofit or an outside group to be able to turn around their campus. But with this new reform, Representative Bernal has allowed those schools to adopt essentially the ACE model, which we used in Hb3, which allows a school to really transform itself, not changing who the kids are or what families they serve, but be able to put in place some of these best practices, these wraparound services, these mental health professionals on campuses, the best teachers in the community, and flooding these schools with those kind of resources. So, I think at the end of the day, although there were a lot of bad ideas about how to improve school quality, there was a major step forward in helping our struggling schools turn around.
This question is open to all of you. Coming into this session during a pandemic, something we have never experienced before the vaccine was widely available to all of the public. I think the public expected a little more action, frankly, when it came to helping people and businesses recover from the pandemic, from the legislature. I want you to talk to us about how COVID impacted the priorities of the session.
Well, I'll go ahead and start. Just say one of the things that COVID did is it impacted how the session actually met, especially initially. We barely met initially. And when we were here, of course, we had to do testing and masks and that sort of thing to protect those of us that were here and make sure we weren't going to be super spreaders. But it also, of course, impacted us before we even got to the Capitol for the legislative session, in that we were not able to have the regular and normal interim hearings that we would have had to prepare for session, which was a real setback in terms of coming in with things in place and already having studied things. And certainly part of the challenge, too, was dealing with the powers that the governor assumed that were beyond what some in the legislature felt were appropriate, or at least went a far distance and stayed there, even though we were back in session. And certainly looking at how we spent the federal dollars was a part of that. But personally, I would also say that a piece of legislation that I've had for many, many sessions now has to do with modernizing our registry system, vaccine registry system called MTRAC. This has been something we've been working on for a long time. It's something providers have wanted. We were always warning about the difficulties we would have with the pandemic, and sure enough, that came to be in light of the fact that we have a system that is not standard, because in Texas, we are one of just a couple of states, just a handful of states, that requires to get your information into the registry, you have to actually opt in rather than opt out. And that means we've had to put in a system that is not off the shelf, if you will, and has been very burdensome and full of errors, and required providers to handwrite and fax things, and created all kinds of challenges with keeping up with the vaccines, with keeping up with who had how many vaccines, all of this information that was critical to getting people covered and safe in our state. And despite that, despite the fact that we had all the providers saying they wanted this, they needed this, they were spending more time on the bureaucratic red tape of this registry than they were on actually delivering care to patients. And it would save dollars in the long run. Despite that, legislation did not pass. It's extremely disappointing that we can't even put things in place with a pandemic that will help us address the pandemic. And I'll let my colleagues talk about some of the other things, but we did not really pass anything that was going to really address how we were going to manage the COVID now and pandemics in the future. I'll let them say some things.
Before we open it to the other members, I want to ask you, Representative, why was the temperature like that? Why was there not an appetite, you believe, for that type of legislation?
You know, not only did I have my bill, but the chairwoman of public health had a bill that was not the same, did not go as far, but at least was going to get us a step forward. And so we were working on that, and it didn't pass either. And I can't tell you exactly why, but the problem, you know, we're on the House. The problem was in the Senate, as it oftentimes is. And there are those that have been listening to a vocal minority who have conflated this issue with mandating vaccinations, people who are opposed to mandated vaccinations, and who also have concerns about privacy, even though the privacy in this legislation and in what we have in Texas is some of the most rigorous privacy protections of any state in the country. So despite all of that, they are still responding to a small but vocal minority and have been unwilling to get this through. I can't explain it other than that. It makes no sense.
Would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, I'll say the one good bill, and then I'll go ahead and be more directly cynical than Representative Howard. But there was one good piece of legislation passed. I think it might have been House Bill 1818 by Representative Jared Patterson, that basically said that first responders who test positive for COVID and either have severe disability from it or death are presumed to have gotten COVID in the line of work. And as someone who lost some first responders in my district to COVID, I think that's a really important piece of legislation. We had a lot of different essential workers step up and take care of Texans and when so many of us could stay home. And folks who are in that position deserve that preemptive assumption that they contracted COVID in the workplace. Now, I don't think that legislation went far enough. It dealt with one class of workers instead of everyone who was essential and stayed in the workplace and took on that extra risk. But I do think that was an important bill to pass. I think that's the only really good thing we did, unfortunately.
Wait, there's one more.
I would think that the business community would think that the no frivolous lawsuits was a pretty good deal.
There's that one. There's another one too, though, that I got passed that had to do with allowing home care nurses and hospice nurses to actually deliver the COVID vaccine. Mm-hmm. It's amazing that there was this bureaucratic problem in the statute that prevented nurses from giving the shots to their patients that were receiving home care and hospice and could not leave their homes. We got that passed and got immediate implementation of that so that could begin happening. So want to throw that one out too.
Good. You're right. Thank you, Donna. We passed that one early in session. So I almost,
yeah, a long time ago.
It's all a whirlwind. Those 140 days go by quick.
Yes. So from my perspective, 2 good bills. And then a couple mixed bag bills. I would put the liability bill in the mixed bag space where there were good elements and bad elements from how we saw it. But everything else was almost taken over by this anti-science conspiracy theory stuff, where even, colleagues who on the other side of the aisle who understood COVID and feared it, or not feared it, but I should say respected it and wanted us to do the right thing, were so afraid of these folks, these extremists who were pushing this anti-science rhetoric. I mean, some of the legislation Representative Howard was just talking about, again, we can't say exactly what happened in the Senate, but what I heard was that there were a whole bunch of phone calls about vaccine passports. Now, I don't know what a vaccine passport is. I've never seen one, but I've received enough emails to know that people are very afraid of them. And we've had some social media chatter about that again. But it just felt like again and again, we were reacting to people's anger from last March or last April instead of thinking about the future, or we were reacting to conspiracy theories. I lost a bill that I had 5 members sign on to kill to on local and consent. And all the bill said was that DSHS would put their contact tracing training materials online. And I was told that they had to kill that bill because people were still so mad about the MTX contract. And I'm like, this is like the populist version of contact tracing, just making it available so that a school official or a university official or a doctor's office can try and go through some of the motions and trace down the source of an infection. And we just saw this play out again and again. We saw many of our colleagues buy into these conspiracy theories. We saw many of our colleagues who didn't still not be willing to stick their necks out and take a more courageous stance on COVID. And quite frankly, it's just been incredibly disappointing to see, and to see us take steps as a legislature that are going to get us in trouble if we do see a new strain of COVID go around the vaccine and cause a resurgence in this pandemic. So you say prepare for the worst, hope for the best. We are only preparing for the best. And I certainly hope that's the scenario we'll see ourselves in. But we've passed some laws this session that are going to cause us some problems if we don't end up in the best case scenario.
I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about Winter Storm Uri. So if we weren't going through enough when this session started with a pandemic, then we were hit with that historic winter storm that cost us lives of our neighbors and did, millions of dollars worth of damage. Representatives Winter, you carried House Bill 2275, which addressed some of the fallout of the storm. Talk to us a little bit about that bill.
Yeah, I think we talked about this a little bit earlier, but House Bill 2275 would have created a grant program using federal dollars to fund infrastructure resiliency projects. That could be as simple as putting a building over a well so that it's easier to keep warm in freezing temperatures. It could be advanced meter infrastructure, or under the legislation, it could be backup generation for a dialysis center, a hospital, a nursing home. That legislation did pass through the House and unfortunately did not get referred by the Lieutenant Governor on the Senate side. And then we added it as an amendment to Senate Bill 3, which is one of the big omnibus storm response bills. But unfortunately, the language was a no-go in the Senate for the mysterious types of reasons Representative Howard alluded to earlier. And so it did not make it into the final version of the bill. But I think that's something we need to think about, is how do we address the challenges of the storm at every single level. And Senate Bill 3 that we passed was a good start, but it didn't go nearly far enough. Senate 3 addresses imperfectly, but does address problems at the generation side, at the industrial side. It doesn't address the challenges we saw with local infrastructure, and it doesn't address folks weatherizing their own homes. When we talk about the power grid, there's two sides of the equation. There's supply and there's also demand. And almost every single thing we did focused on supply, even though there's at least 10,000 megawatts of power we can save from efficiency projects. So I hope that when we come back in a special, that energy will be on the table again. We'll be able to take a more serious look about addressing the demand side as well. And then also looking at some of this infrastructure resiliency projects.
The Senate wanted to pass legislation to, they would say, fix or correct some of those funding errors that happened during the storm that cost billions of dollars to these companies. They passed that legislation quickly, unanimously. Representative Talarico, it died in the House. It did not make it far at all. Talk to us about why that is. Do you know? Give us some insight.
Yeah, I mean, I don't pretend to know all of the ins and outs of the Senate-House conflict. Oftentimes, that's I do speak Republican, but I'm not fluent, and so it's not something I know a lot about, the intra-party conflicts over on that side. But I will just say, and this for those that are watching who maybe aren't as familiar with the Texas legislature or how the process works, Representative Howard alluded to this in the beginning, but the reason that the three of us keep talking about, not enough focus or not enough attention was given to this issue over something else. The reason that's important is because here in our state, we only meet as a legislature once every other year, and only for 5 months. Actually, those 5 months are really like 3 months because you can't consider bills in the first two, and so that's 3 months every other year to solve huge challenges that a big, complex, diverse state like Texas faces. And so, when we talk about the pandemic, which we mentioned earlier, or the response to the winter storm, those priorities, don't get the oxygen they need because all the oxygen is taken up by things like permitless carry, things like the heartbeat bill, things like critical race theory, which I didn't think was a huge problem in our state, but I guess some of my colleagues did. So, these distractions may seem like they are frivolous, or they may seem that they are, just playing politics. But the reason they're dangerous, not only because they hurt people in our state, but legislatively speaking, they're dangerous because they take up the precious time that we have together in that big pink building to solve these major challenges. So that's why I think you hear us coming back to this theme of failing to prioritize issues that really impact people's lives.
Representative Howard, you are one of the few lawmakers that we heard very vocally say that the legislature needed to take some of the blame for what happened during Winter Storm Uri. You said that ERCOT and the PUC were following orders. They were operating under the policies that were passed by the legislature. So do you think that the bills that were passed will help solve the energy problem and prevent another crisis? Were they at least enough? Because we know that we're supposed to have record heat this summer. And there's a lot of people are quite nervous about what's going to happen this summer.
Well, despite the fact that I know that the governor was on record yesterday of saying that all of the the flaws in the system have been fixed. I would dispute that. I think we did make some initial steps, but my concern is, as you pointed out, Ashley, Texans died. Businesses were without the power they needed to function. We know here in Austin, Samsung lost, I don't even know what the final number is, because of being shut down as a result of what happened with our power crisis. We cannot afford to let that happen again. And we put some things in place, but when we have the heat of summer, we could have another blackout. Then we are not going to be prepared based on what we just did. Even next winter, we're not going to have things in place that are going to prepare us for that. We got some things in to address weatherization, but it's minimal what we put in there. We didn't learn from our lesson of a decade ago that we need to enforce these things. I'm proud to say that in terms of science, I was able to get an amendment into Hb3, whichever it was, SB3, that had the climatologist, state climatologist, be a part of the discussion, so we can actually look at climate patterns as we're preparing for this. And we were able to protect renewables, which were being villainized. The fact is that we did all have a role to play in this. The legislature absolutely had a role to play in this and still does. The gas industry does, the electric industry does. ERCOT, I have to say, despite what any criticism some might have of what they did, it was absolutely horrifying to see the graphs and charts that they showed us of what was happening when they were making their moment-to-moment decisions as plants went offline. We had mere minutes before our state was going to be in a total shutdown, which could have taken months to get us back up. So we could fault different things, but that decision was made to save our state. Unfortunately, because of the gas electric interconnectivity and the lack of communication and coordination, we ended up with disastrous effects from the shutdown that we hope will be changed by better communications and a better plan. But that's not going to happen right away. We have more work to do. I would love for the governor to place this on the special session, one of the many special sessions we're anticipating having, and begin interim hearings immediately. We need this for Texans' health and well-being, and we need it for our economy. We cannot afford to lose power.
You know, here recently, there's been a push to pass bills related to Texas's trans community. And we saw several bills that would impact trans children filed this session. Representative Weiner, you helped lead the charge against many of these bills. But I want you to talk to us about the role the business community played in your fight to kill some of these bills.
Yeah, this was Bathroom Bill 3.0, and I'm unsure why we keep having these conversations. There was legislation to ban trans children from receiving gender-affirming care. Some of that legislation targeted medical providers. Some of it targeted parents and labeled the practice as child abuse. And then there was also legislation to say that trans children could not compete in athletics as the gender they identify as. And really what all of this legislation was about was just othering trans kids. And in addition to harming trans kids, the sports bill in particular set up cis girls to potentially be targeted for being good at athletics and being asked to potentially prove that they were cisgender. We don't need lawmakers getting involved in people's genitalia. Full stop. That is something we need to stay out of. So these were bills that were about culture war signaling, not about any actual policy, not about any actual situations in Texas. And they were incredibly, the conversations around them were incredibly misrepresentative of both the care a lot of trans youth receive and then the role trans youth have in athletics today. So I'm really glad we were able to fight these. And I just want to say, full stop, we could not have done it without the business community. The business community standing up and saying hate is bad for Texas business. is part of why we were successful at beating the bathroom bill in 2017, and it's why we were successful in beating these bills in 2021. And so I really appreciate all of the business community members who showed up at the Capitol, who talked to the Lieutenant Governor's office, the Speaker's office, talked to the chairs of these various committees, and told them the harm it would do. And y'all are absolutely right. Texas does not need this black eye. It does not help Texas recruit workers or businesses that help us be successful. It is an incredibly frustrating thing to serve in this time where there's so much celebration of Texas's economic success, and then see lawmakers consistently try to sabotage it by going after these culture war issues that are just unnecessary. So the business community showing up really made a tremendous difference, and I think is key to our ultimate success. So thank you.
Representative Talarico, you sit on a highly coveted and incredibly important committee, and that would be the calendars committee. They get to decide if and when, big emphasis on if and when bills make it to the floor. It's largely done behind closed doors. So I want you to talk to us about what it's like to be in that room and for you to try to stop some of the bills that you don't agree with.
Well, when I first got put on there, I thought we were going to be in charge of creating the decorative calendar that we all get at the end of session. Turns out that's not what it does, even though that's what the name suggests. So, before a bill can get to the floor, it has to be filed by a member, and then it has to be assigned to a committee. You have to get a hearing. You got to get it passed out of committee. And most folks think once it's passed out of committee, it gets to the floor. And many people don't realize that there's kind of this middle step of getting through the calendars committee, which is a procedural committee that kind of sets the calendar every day on the floor, or I guess you could call it an agenda. What bills are we going to hear, and in what order are we going to hear them? And it's an interesting committee because you're having to, in many ways, fight for bills that you think are good bills to get a chance to be voted on the floor. And that can be difficult because the people in that committee have different ideas about what should be a priority and what shouldn't be a priority. And that's where a lot of the conflict between the members of that committee arises because of that disagreement about what should be heard on the floor of the Texas House. Real quick, I wanted to make a comment about, we've, Representative Zwiener just talked about the anti-trans bills that came through. We've talked about some of the other kind of crazy sounding ideas that were passed into law this session. And that tends to be a direct result of our redistricting process, which I hope we'll get a chance to discuss because that'll be what the special session's about later this fall. But here in Texas, we draw our own legislative boundaries. We draw our own districts. So you have politicians drawing the districts they represent. And what you tend to do, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, is want to draw a safe seat. So you want to draw a district that's, almost entirely Democratic or almost entirely Republican. So that way you have an easier chance of getting reelected. The problem with that is then that, you're really catering to the extreme voices in your own party. And you are relying on primary voters to get you elected. If you are in an 80% Republican district, your only obstacle to getting reelected is getting through the primary. The reason I say that is because appealing to Republican primary voters is what motivated almost every single crazy thing that came out of this session. And it's the reason that a lot of important issues died without getting a hearing or not getting a vote on the floor. So until we take a look at the structural problems in our democracy, like our primary system, like gerrymandering, you're not going to see better public policy outcomes. Leaders in the Austin chamber have probably met with many legislators who seem reasonable. They are reasonable when you talk to them one-on-one. Many of them are serious policymakers who want to do serious work. But because they're trapped in a bad system, they tend to act in bad ways and in bad faith. And that's something that we've got to address long-term if we want to see better outcomes in our state government.
We are running out of time, unfortunately. And so we only have one final question for each of you, and you'll each get a minute to respond to this. But Governor Greg Abbott has indicated there will be 2 special sessions now. There was one expected, of course, in the fall for redistricting, which Representative Talarico just told us all about. The one before that, though, he wants to pass election reform, bail reform, and other presumably conservative priority bills. Give us some thoughts on what we can expect for that. Representative Zwiener, we'll start with you.
I think you can expect it to be a pretty fraught special session. I think it was so interesting to me watching the fallout of us walking out and killing Senate Bill 7 this session. And one of the things that to me really took me by surprise afterwards was seeing people start to say from the Republican side of the aisle that there were mistakes in the bill. And that gives me a lot of hope that folks are going to take a clean look at this legislation and make sure that we have, if we are going to pass election reform, if we are going to pass legislation based on this big lie that this last election was stolen, that we at least won't do things that are actively harmful to people of Texas in the process. So it gives me some hope that there's going to be a brighter light shown on it, that folks are going to have more of an opportunity to be engaged in the process, so that we won't have provisions in there that make it easy for any judge to overturn an election. And we won't have provisions that end souls to the polls programs at Black churches. So that's some of my hope for the session. I will lean on Representative Howard and her experience of special sessions to let me know how reasonable my hopes are. But that's what I'm thinking about. I'm hoping there's going to be a very bright light shown on this legislation instead of us having a 200-page conference committee report with less than 24 hours to review it. So I'm hopeful that bright light will result in better policy.
Representative Talarico.
Yeah, Representative Zwiener is spot on. I think as the phrase in the Capitol is, there's nothing special about a special session. And that's probably going to be true 2 times over by year's end. And, I Representative Zwiener thanked the business community for speaking out against the anti-trans bills. I also want to thank the business community for speaking out against the voter suppression bill, because a lot of major companies in the state put real pressure on lawmakers not to disenfranchise Texans, not to return to the days of Jim Crow. And that means a lot in that building where we all work. The hardest part about this job is actually not, a lot of people think that we spend our time debating different views on an issue. That's not what we spend a lot of our time doing, unfortunately. We ended up debating about whether a problem is a real problem. So it's not that we're debating solutions to a problem, we're debating the problem itself, because voter fraud is non-existent in Texas based on all the data, based on all the evidence, all the everything that you look at. Texans don't commit voter fraud. You are more likely to get struck by lightning than you are to commit voter fraud in the state of Texas. Yet we are devoting enormous amounts of political energy and legislative time to solving a non-existent problem. That's also true for the trans bill. There is I questioned the author in committee and asked for one documented case of a trans athlete causing a problem on a sports team in Texas, and they couldn't name one. So again, it's a solution in search of a problem. And until we can reform some of these parts of our political system that give us these silly debates, we're going to see this more and more as our politics become more polarized. So I thank the business community for stepping up and being a voice of reason in this past session.
Representative Howard, what can we expect out of these 2, maybe more, special sessions?
Well, I have to also chime in on thanking the business community for being vocal about any kind of discriminatory legislation. And discriminating against voters is clearly not the direction that we want to go. I hope also that it will be clear when we are able to talk about this without a bunch of other issues, sucking up oxygen in the room, that we can really look at what can be done to make elections more accessible to folks and make sure that they're being done in such a way that every American, every Texan has access to their right to vote. And I think it's going to be important, and I think the business community recognized this, that though this disproportionately impacts people of color, Texans of color, it also affects those that have disabilities. It affects those that are senior citizens. It affects Democrats, Republicans, anyone who goes to the polls, who enjoys being able to have early voting, has more options about where they can vote. These are the kinds of things that I think we all want, all Texans want. And we need to know what's in this bill so that we can pass something that really supports Texans and our right to vote. And I'm also hopeful that the governor doesn't follow through with this ridiculous threat of defunding the legislative branch of government, which is just mind-boggling to me. But regardless of that, we are going to be supporting our state employees and making sure that they do not lose their jobs as a result of the decision we made to use the rules we had to use to break quorum to prevent this undemocratic bill from passing. So stay tuned, as the governor says. There's lots to see here.
Plenty to see. Representatives, we thank you all so much for taking some time to chat with us. I'm going to turn things back over to Dana now.
Thank y'all.
What a great discussion. Thank you so much to Representative Howard, Weiner, and Talarico. And thanks for, I know you all worked so hard during this session, and thanks for all you did. And Ashley, thanks for everything today, for moderating our discussion. And then I also want to, last but not least, thank our sponsors again for your continued support. I think they have posted in the chat upcoming events for the chamber, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you so much.